Vincennes, 1978. The corridor is cold, painted the color of old water. A clerk rolls open a steel drawer that complains in rust. Inside, a brown file sleeps beneath a film of dust. The cover says only, Confidentiel, Armée du Nord. The edges are frayed like cloth that's been worried by hands. When the string is loosened, paper exhales a dry, sweet breath. First page, Rapport 12F, Prisonnières Africaines, Juin 1940. The text is neat until a red pencil slashes the center line, a wound from margin to margin. Exécuté sur place, non-conformes à la Convention de Genève. Executed on the spot, not compliant with the Geneva Convention. Below it, a French signature holds steady, not foreign, homegrown. A smaller hand has added one more sentence, tight and careful. Race non-européenne à éliminer pour discipline. Non-European race to be eliminated for discipline. The paper shows where a pen pressed too hard and trembled back. A thumbnail crescent of carbon smudge marks the corner. Someone touched this in haste or shame. Further in, a list of units and head counts. A column for tirailleurs runs true, then stops. Names do not end, they vanish. A long dash replaces 80 lives. Silence moves through the room like a draft. The clerk clears his throat and says nothing. The file is closed again. But something is already opened, not a case, a memory. It took 40 years for this paper to breathe. It will take longer for the country that signed it. June 20th, 1940. The German front has crossed the Loire. The French army has ceased to be an army, only clusters of uniforms walking home. 2 reports are written that day by the same division, the 25e Régiment de Tirailleurs Sénégalais. One says simply, all prisoners transferred to German custody. The other, marked with the same date, carries a blank space where 80 names should be. The column is left open, a dash stretching across white like a scar. A German officer initials the margin in blue pencil. No need for transport. Order carried out. No stamp, no witness, no body, just the bureaucratic calm of murder written in future perfect tense. The ink is different from the rest, darker, almost wet. Someone added it later. The page bears a fingerprint, faint, oily. The thumb-sized. Maybe the man who signed it wanted to leave proof without leaving guilt. In Paris that same day, radio voices urge surrender. The word honor is used 13 times. Not once does it mention color. A week later, a farmer near Chasselay notes in his ledger, they sang before the shooting. He draws a line under it and continues with crop prices. 2 documents, one day. One ends in captivity, the other in dirt. It shouldn't exist, but it does. That's where this story begins. They called them Tirailleurs Sénégalais, but that name was a lie from the start. They were not all Senegalese, and they did not all volunteer. They came from across West Africa, Mali, Niger, Chad, Benin, Guinea. Men who had never seen the sea now wore a uniform stitched in Marseille and fought for a country that spoke a language they barely knew. In 1939, France gathered them again. 200,000 black soldiers sailed north, told that the Republic would remember them as sons. Posters in Dakar said, Pour la liberté, la France vous appelle, for liberty. But liberty had conditions. They trained in Fréjus on the southern coast. The locals called them les Africains, watched them march in dust that wasn't their own. They sang La Marseillaise in broken accents, and their officers smiled because it looked like unity. By May 1940, the Wehrmacht came through Belgium like water through glass. French lines broke, then shattered. But the black regiments fought longer than most. At the Somme, at Guyenne, at the Loire, they dug in with hands that had once tilled other men's soil. A captured German report admitted it. The African units resist to the last. Their morale is remarkable. That line reached Berlin. It displeased Hitler. A week later, a message left his headquarters. No black prisoners. It was never written into orders. It didn't have to be. The Wehrmacht understood. According to the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were to be treated humanely, without distinction of race, nationality, or religion. France had signed that treaty. Germany had signed it too. But war makes paper weak. When France collapsed, officers surrendered in groups, whole battalions laying down arms. White soldiers were processed, listed, fed. Black soldiers were separated for verification. It sounded administrative. It meant execution. Some French commanders tried to protest, but most simply looked away. A major from the Armée du Nord wrote in his diary, "They slow the march. It is better to leave them." In Paris, officials of the new Vichy regime wrote a different kind of language, one made of categories, of who belonged and who didn't. They called these men non-European troops. They said it softly, but it meant the same as a bullet said loudly. On paper, they were still part of the Republic. In the fields of the Rhone, they were something less defined, too French to escape, not French enough to live. The contradiction was perfect. France had taught them liberté, égalité, fraternité, and the Reich made sure they learned which word broke first. The law said they were prisoners of war. History would call them something else, the soldiers of a nation that loved their courage, but not their color. June 20th, 1940, near Chasselay, Rhone. The dawn was quiet, the kind of silence that makes even birds wait. Mist clung to the wheat fields where the black troops had stacked their rifles. A German officer stood on a truck bed, reading names from a list that ended too soon. "Whites to the road," he said in broken French. "Blacks to the field." The words cut clean. Even the wind seemed to understand which direction not to take. A French captain, unarmed, shaking, tried to reason. "They are prisoners of war," he said. A Bavarian sergeant answered, "Not these." The men obeyed the logic of hierarchy, not conscience. The white captives were marched west, the African soldiers east, toward the edge of a rye field glistening with dew. They were told to sit, then to stand, then to face the horizon. No sentence was read, no judge was present, just a rhythm of orders that led in one direction only. A Senegalese sergeant, tall and calm, straightened his collar. He had once been a schoolteacher in St. Louis. He spoke 4 languages, none of which could save him. He looked at his men and said, "Stand proud." They began to sing, not La Marseillaise, but a hymn from the Sahel, a song of journey, of ancestors, of endurance. It rose from 80 throats into a morning that deserved better. The first machine gun stuttered. The wheat moved as if from wind. No one screamed, no one ran. A farmer crouched behind his barn counted bursts, 1, then 2, and wrote it down because he didn't know what else to do with horror. By noon, the arithmetic was complete. 80 men gone, one report corrected. A German quartermaster filled out his day's log. Ammunition expended, 2 belts, MG-34, rations, unchanged. He left the column casualties empty. There were none on his side. That evening, trucks arrived carrying soil. Locals were paid in chits to dig and cover. One boy hid a chit under the floorboard of his house. He could not read, but he knew paper outlives memory. At Chartres, a week later, French officers in captivity noticed something odd. Their own camps were full, but the neighboring one, the one where the African soldiers had stood, was empty, bowls still set in neat lines along the ground. No one had collected them. The soup had dried where it spilled. A lieutenant wrote in his notebook, "They said the black companies were moved east, but the road west was full of trucks carrying earth." He tore the page out, hid it in the lining of his tunic because the living were easier to lose than the truth. Across France that week, it happened again. In Irènes, in Clemecy, in Arakan-Villers, 100 here, 50 there. Each village added its own silence to the record. The Red Cross asked questions. The Wehrmacht answered with forms. Each form reduced humanity to lines and digits, one for each day, one for each absence, and none for the color that explained them all. By dusk, the field near Chasselay looked normal again. The rye had been flattened, then brushed upright. A German lieutenant sent a postcard home. A quiet day in France. The weather was kind. Years later, that card would still smell faintly of oil and dust. No words about the shooting. None were needed. Color had been the only language anyone understood that day. The next morning, the farmer returned to the field. He found a single cap, blue with red piping, and tucked it into the hollow of a tree. He told no one. The cap stayed there until roots began to grow through it. Not panic, not confusion, arithmetic. By dawn, a song. By noon, silence. By nightfall, the earth had learned a new number, and the Republic had lost more than men. It had lost the right to call itself indivisible. Chartres, July 1940. The sugar factory had become a camp. Its machines were gone, but the smell of burnt syrup lingered. Sweet, heavy, impossible to wash away. Outside, German guards paced between fences strung with new wire. Inside, French officers sat on crates, uniforms still creased from the day of surrender. They spoke little. Not about defeat, everyone understood that part, but about the names that had vanished from the morning roll call. A young lieutenant, barely 25, unfolded a copy of the German prisoner list. "Where are the Senegalese companies?" he asked. No one met his eyes. The captain beside him rubbed his temples. "They were transferred," he said quietly. "To where?" No answer. Another officer muttered, "I saw them at the Loire. They were separated from us." The lieutenant pressed again, his voice cracking. "They fought with us. They held the bridge when the rest of us ran. Where are they now?" The captain placed the report on the table. The paper shook in his hands, not from fear, but from fatigue. "If they are not French enough to live," his voice faltered, "then what are we?" No one replied. The question stayed between them like smoke. The men sat in silence. They could hear the hum of German generators outside, the scrape of boots on concrete, and faintly, through the open slats of the window, the sound of singing, not German, not French, from the far yard. It was the last night the African prisoners sang. By morning, their side of the camp was empty. The fence still carried their fingerprints, dust mixed with sugar where hands had pressed too long. When the guards came to count, the numbers fit neatly again. Neatness comforted the bureaucracy. That evening, the lieutenant found an old photograph folded in his wallet, a group portrait from before the retreat. Black soldiers smiling beside white ones, arms draped across shoulders, mud and laughter binding them closer than the Republic ever had. He turned it over. On the back, a single line in pencil. "Brothers." He tore the picture in half, then stopped. Half a face remained, a man named Becquerie from St. Louis. The lieutenant couldn't throw it away. He hid it in the heel of his boot, as if guilt needed weight. At night, the camp lamps flickered. The men sat awake speaking in whispers that were really confessions. "They died for a flag that wasn't ready for them," one said. "Then we're dying for a flag that doesn't deserve them," another answered. No one argued. They all understood. Defeat was no longer military. It was moral. Outside, rain began to fall. Water dripped through holes in the roof, each drop a slow metronome marking the rhythm of silence. In Paris, under German occupation, the new Vichy government drafted its own language of obedience. They created a category for the forgotten: prisonniers de couleur, non-prioritaires, non-priority prisoners, non-priority humans. Back in Chartres, the captain whispered to the young lieutenant, "Paris won't speak for them." He was right. Paris would not. By morning, the camp bell rang. No roll call for the missing, no mention in any file, just the dull certainty that something irreparable had been agreed upon, not signed, not spoken, but accepted. Freedom had a color, and it wasn't theirs. When the lights went out, the lieutenant stared into the dark and thought, the Germans didn't need to teach us cruelty. We brought our own. The war ended. France rose again. Flags waved, bands played, medals shone on new uniforms. But in the south, near Lyon, there was a patch of land that refused to celebrate. The ground still breathed differently there. In the late 1940s, they built a memorial, the Tata Sénégalais de Chasselay, a rectangle of red earth walls shaped like a fort, African in form, French in apology. Inside lay 188 men, most without names. The plaque read, Aux tirailleurs africains morts pour la France. For France, not of France. No family attended the ceremony. The mothers were in St. Louis, in Bamako, in Dakar, too far, too poor, too forgotten to be invited. A priest spoke of honor and sacrifice, and the officials nodded as if that could bury what had already been buried twice. The Republic moved on. It rebuilt railways, repainted ministries, but did not reopen the drawers labeled AFR. Inside them slept the paper ghosts. Lists, reports, memos with tidy signatures. Each one had a hole where a name should be. In 1951, the Ministry of Veterans Affairs received a letter written in careful script. My husband, Bakary Diop, died in June 1940 fighting for France. Please confirm his pension. 6 months later, a typed reply came. No proof of French nationality. File closed. That was the price of dying in another man's war. You lost even your citizenship in death. By the 1960s, France had new wars. Indochina, Algeria, new soldiers, new silences. The old files stayed where they were. Even history prefers fresh wounds. Then, one afternoon in 1974, a historian named Marcel C. opened a cabinet marked Divers. Inside, a folder read, AFR, Prisonniers. He opened it and found only copies, not originals. Each had a missing column, the same clean dash through 80 names. At the bottom of one page, a note in faint pencil, removed from record, by instruction. He took the file to his superior. The man read it, frowned, and said softly, "Don't say executed, say not accounted for. It sounds cleaner." Marcel closed the folder and realized that even silence had grammar. A few years later, he published a short paper. It was ignored. The archives stayed sealed. The ghosts stayed patient. In 1988, an old man returned to Chasselay with his grandson. He had been a boy in 1940, the one who hid the pay chit under his floorboard. He carried it now in a glass envelope, yellowed and soft. He knelt by the wall of the Tata, pressed it into the earth and said, "Here, this is where the lie began." The child asked, "What lie?" He didn't answer. Some truths need to stay questions. A wind came down from the hills, dry and red, lifting dust into the air until it shimmered like smoke. For a moment the sky looked divided, half blue, half the color of their blood. France had survived the war, but the France they fought for never returned. They had stood in front of rifles believing liberty meant them too. They were wrong. The republic that rose again carried new words, justice, progress, pride, but left theirs behind, buried with the receipts for the shovels. They fought for a flag that never fought for them. And the nation learned to live comfortably with that silence. Evening settles over Chasselay. The sun drifts behind the hills, staining the red walls of the Tata Sénégalais the color of dried blood. Tourists wander the path in silence, unsure of what to say. Some whisper that the place feels peaceful. It isn't. It's polite, and that is not the same thing. Inside the courtyard, rows of low graves lie side by side. No marble, no names, only small metal plates, each stamped in canoe. Unknown. In the center, a single flagpole rises without a flag. The wind moves through it, searching for something to carry. A guide explains that the soldiers here died for France. He doesn't mention that France forgot to let them belong. He doesn't have to. The silence explains it better. Somewhere below the earth lies a man who once believed he was French. His mother called him Mamadou. His captain called him Sénégalais. History called him nothing at all. In Paris, the file that began this story, Rapport 12F, Prisonniers Africains, Juin 1940, sits again in the archives. The pages are brittle now, their ink faded to the color of rainwater. A clerk has taped the torn edge. No one remembers who last opened it. No one wants to. They called them Les Soldats Noirs, but France never called them home. The world remembers Dunkirk, the resistance, the liberation of Paris. No monuments stand for the men who sang before the shots. Their melody lingers only in the wind, a sound that trembles like memory. Soft, persistent, unwilling to die. If you stand here long enough, you can almost hear it. A hum beneath the cicadas, a rhythm that refuses to end where history said it should. They didn't ask for pity. They asked to be remembered, not as symbols, not as victims, as soldiers who believed the words liberté, égalité, fraternité meant them too. When a nation asks you to die for it, but denies you the right to belong to it, what do you call that? Patriotism? Or belonging denied in a uniform? They called it duty. They called it order. They called it history. But some truths do not die with silence. They wait, patient, inconvenient, alive in the dust. I call it blindness. You tell me.